But I want to start by sort of giving you a grounding in what this book is about and how it came about. In this book, what I do is I look at the concept of environmental justice. Now, environmental justice is understood. It's really a discourse, and it includes a lot of different elements, you would say. Like environmental justice is activism. It's also theory, and and it's policy and law. And so it's all of these things that we can mean different things when we say that term environmental justice. And in the academic world, the way we understand this concept of environmental justice, at the core of it is this concept known as environmental racism. This has been it's very well established. We have not even had the concept of environmental injustice and justice is really it's not that old. It really only begins around the early 1980s, and it comes out of the Deep South, out of Black communities in the Deep South, fighting against the intentional siting of toxic waste dumps in their communities. And so they said that, we're targeted because we're targeted for these noxious facilities because we're Black and we're powerless and we're poor. And so they called that environmental racism, and it worked. And so all of, the early literature talked about, the earliest studies, in fact, made that argument, and it turned out to be there was plenty of evidence for this thing called environmental racism. So this concept of environmental racism, it centers race as kind of the analytic lens that you look at this type of injustice through. And it works. But as an undergrad, I was in an American Indian Studies program at the University of New Mexico, and I took my first environmental justice class, and I discovered that, and this is probably 15 years ago now, and when I was in that class, the literature was sort of cobbled together, and there wasn't a real there was almost no literature written by Indigenous or Native American studies people. And it didn't include the topics that I understood at the core of like an environment, like a Native American studies methodology. So largely we were absent in that literature, and I found that very deeply unsatisfying. And then I got into grad school, and I took another environmental justice class, an entirely different department in the American Studies department, and in that class I saw no Native perspectives, not even any. We weren't reading any Native authors at all. And so we were completely erased. Erasure is one of the things that sort of defines who we are in the settler state. And there was almost nothing, we weren't reading anything relative to our realities. So I set out to understand, what does environmental justice theory look like when American Indian people are centered? And so I wrote a master's thesis on it, and that's really where this book comes from. There's that's the origin of it. And so in that study, in that thesis, and in this book, what I argue is that for American Indians, talking about environmental justice must begin with the history of invasion, genocide, and land theft, and what we call settler colonialism. And that unless it attends to these histories, it can never be responsive to us. It will never really fit. Environmental justice and the way we think about environmental justice just won't work. And it also must acknowledge the political difference of American Indians. So American Indians as nations with the political relationship to the state, we are not ethnic minorities. And that's one of the first things I was taught in American Indian Studies was, we are not ethnic minorities. We have this political nation-to-nation relationship with the state. And so unless environmental justice theory can account for that, then it doesn't mean anything to us. So and there are some other things too, and I'll get to that in a minute. So what do we mean when we say settler colonialism? What are we talking about? We're talking about this concept that American Indian Studies, really works from. I mean, this is how American Indian Studies like emerges from. Really, it centers around this concept, and it's pretty widely accepted at this point. It's not just post-colonial studies, right? We don't fit in that because there is, for us, no post and post-colonial, and that's the distinction. Is that settler colonialism is seen as a structure. It's something that's ongoing, like it never ends, because of the structure. Well, I'll get to that in a minute. But I wanted to share this image. I think we're all really familiar with this image, the image that sort of embodies the concept of manifest destiny. And this is the quintessential representation of that, with the angelic looking Columbia. And Columbia is, spreading, she's emerged, she's coming from the east and she's heading west, and she's not really an angel, but she's sort of angelic looking. And, she has a book in her hand, and it looks kind of like, you might think it's a Bible, but it's not really a Bible. It actually says education on it. And she's got with her, she's stringing this wire. And so the wire is presumably a telegraph wire. So there's this element of technology that she's bringing. She's bringing the light of education and the light of technology as she sweeps across the land, in partnership or together in parallel with the intrepid pioneers and the railroad. And in the background you see these boats and these urbanizing land spaces. And then in the foreground, or to the left, to the west, of course, is darkness, and she's chasing out the darkness. And who represents the darkness? No better than the Indians, who are running away from that, and the buffalo are, they're all fading into the darkness as the light sweeps across the land. This is what we're all conditioned to think. This is the perfect visual message of the typical American narrative. And so in this narrative, what we are told is that Europeans and Euro-American centrism here is, and their knowledge is superior to indigenous knowledge and to indigenous people. Indigenous people are, the backwards. They represent, cultures that are doomed to fade away, doomed to die, and so. All of this is bound up with religion, and because why? Because manifest destiny. If we think about manifest destiny, embodied in that is all about these narratives of divine guidance or divine inspiration. This is meant by God. It was meant by God for Americans to spread out west and take the land, and it's their divine right and inheritance, and that. All of this gets bound up. It's a very big conversation. It goes back to, the Roman Catholic Church and the papal bulls of the 15th century. These, before Europeans even set foot on this continent, they had this whole plan worked out through these series of papal bulls that ultimately legitimize the violent takeover of the lands based on Christianity, based on the fact that when they get to the lands that they haven't been to yet, but they know they're going to get there and they're going to find people there, and when they get there, they know they're not going to be Christians, and so they construct this whole narrative about when they do get there, and because they are obligated to spread the word of God, they have divine right and title to the land. This is the history, and it all gets coded into the legal system, beginning with the first Supreme Court decision related to Indians, which is known as Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823, and what became and still is known as the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery is the foundation of federal Indian law today. And so you have this hugely problematic, entanglement of religion and constructing indigenous peoples and as inferior because they're not Christian. So this is the actual foundation of federal Indian law in this country, which is why we say that it's still a structure. So that the colonialism is a structure that continues to shape the lands and lives of Native people. So it's very paternalistic. It's very hegemonic. This relationship, it's not, we talk about sovereignty, but it's not actual sovereignty. It's only semi-sovereignty, and it's sovereignty almost in name only. And so when we talk about privilege, we're kind of used to hearing conversations in racial justice circles around white privilege, right? And we're sort of, especially recently, with the ethnic uprisings of this year, we hear this. You've been hearing a lot about white privilege, and so it centers race as that which determines privilege. But for American Indians, it's different, and that's some of the arguments I'm making in the new book. It's really not accurate. It's not as accurate to say. To talk about racism in this hegemonic paternalistic relationship toward American Indians. It's really more accurate to say settler privilege because for Native Americans, it always begins with land. It always begins with genocide, the killing of our ancestors for the taking of land. And that's that settler reality. Okay. So the idea of manifest destiny and what that painting represents is it's really a part of the narrative of that is, the narrative of progress. It's progress and modernity. And as, European Americans flood westward in these exploding populations, bringing all this technology and the Industrial Revolution, it's said to bring the modern world and bringing the land, the taming of the land, the taming of the West, all these kind of euphemisms that we have in this country to describe these processes. And but from an American Indian perspective, it's not that at all. It's something completely opposite. It's that while this new technology is sweeping across the land, making the condition of possibility for European populations. What it's doing for Indigenous people is it's robbing them of their rights, of not just their rights, but their ability to exist as Native people on the land. It comes with the actual physical killing of them, number one, but it also comes with the environmental disruption so profound that they become, their ways of life become completely negated and endangered. And we call this, it's because of this remaking of the land, and we call this ecocide. This term ecocide combines the word like ecosystem or ecology with the word genocide, and it brings those two processes together because one doesn't happen without the other for Native people. And so it's been called slow death. It's like slow genocide through the continual contamination of the land of these Native homelands. So the point is that while we have these narratives of progress and modernity with technology, it's ecocide and the slow death of Indigenous people. I also write about, so I'm giving you kind of like the highlights of what I'm writing about, what I've written about in this book, and the kinds of things that we need to think about environmental justice discourse relative to Native peoples that has not really been framed in that way. I also do a pretty hard look at the environmental movement and the environmental movement's history of in its role in these genocidal processes. So even though I said earlier that this racial lens is inappropriate for framing Indigenous issues, white supremacy is still nonetheless a reality, and the beginning of the environmental movement is all bound up with this white supremacy, this white European cultural supremacy, and we look at that. The proto, what's sometimes called the proto-environmental movement, is with the conservation and preservation movements, which we can trace back to the 1870s with the creation of the national park system. And the early writings, that was very much influenced by some of the thinkers of the time, which were people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, who were contemporaries of each other and very influenced. Thoreau was very influenced by Emerson, and then Muir was very influenced by Thoreau. Thoreau, though, is considered this hero in the environmental movement. Kind of one of the patron saints of the environmental movement. And Thoreau, he's been written about a lot, and he's even been written about for his, sort of, supposedly benevolent views about American Indians. He was pretty obsessed with American Indians and wrote about them a lot. He has a whole book called The Maine Woods, where he writes about his friendship with two Penobscot Indians and what he learns from them. And he wrote a lot in both published and unpublished manuscripts about Native people, that show what I call a fetishization. He was fixated on Indian people, and because he thought that they've lived on the land in appropriate ways that could be learned from, but the thing is like, even though he wrote about that and he seemed to believe that, ultimately he was a man of his times, and in those times, it also coincides with the beginning of the anthropology as an academic discipline, and what we call today social Darwinism. And social Darwinism was about these ideas of human civilizations and evolution, where some people were seen to be, in higher states of civilization, right? And it's always white Europeans who are at the pinnacle of civilization, and everybody else was somewhere below that in some form of evolution, to aspire to this high exalted state of civilization. Native people and Black people were always at the bottom of that pyramid. And so Thoreau really bought into that. He really believed ultimately that Native people, even though he loved them and he respected the way they lived on the land, he believed that because they weren't Christians, they were ultimately doomed to fade away. And so that's just one example of how all of this gets baked into the early environmental movement through conservationists. And it also is paralleling the federal Indian policy of the time, which was very aggressive. The federal government was aggressively pursuing these treaties that were about chasing Native people off their lands. So you have this, at this time, this anxiety, this collective anxiety about urbanization in the East. And as people are moving west, they're looking at the wild spaces and, understand that there's all these very highly romanticized aspects to this about the West and, and settling the West and the open frontiers and all of that stuff that are so, embedded in our cultural landscape. All of this is inseparable. So, but at the same time, the federal government is chasing Indians off their lands, and there's Mark David Spence in his groundbreaking book called Dispossessing the Wilderness. Talks about how he looks at the beginning of the national park systems, especially Yellowstone, Glacier, and Yosemite. And he says that he talks about how the philosophies of building these national parks was based on these wonderland, these natural wonderlands, and this idea of wilderness, and wilderness as being free of humans. And he says that the problem with that is that while they're pursuing this project to protect the wilderness first has to be created, and that's what he's talking about how the federal government is chasing Native people off the land in order to create these parks. And so we can't. So the environmental movement begins with all of this, and so I look at that genocidal history. So I want to shift gears a little bit here now and talk about Indigenous knowledge and how Indigenous knowledge comes into play when we're talking about Native people's relationship to the land. Native people, Indigenous relationship to the land is very different than settler society's relationship to the land. And that's why Native people lived on the land sustainably for thousands of years, right? They understood how to live within the limits of an ecosystem, of various ecosystems. And this is what, builds what are ultimately sustainable societies. And but it's not just like, sometimes the word wisdom, like native wisdom or native folklore, and native mythologies, like these words get used to convey something that is not quite science. It's not quite knowledge. And it's not quite legitimate knowledge. It's romanticized. But Indigenous knowledge systems are what Native scholars call epistemologies, or cultural epistemologies that are based on thousands of years of experience living in ecosystems. And so these knowledge systems, there's not one monolithic, one Indigenous knowledge, but there are many Indigenous knowledges, because they emerge from their relationships to land and place and ecosystems. And traditional ecological knowledge is one type of environmental knowledge. And the thing to understand about it is that traditional ecological knowledge is not just theoretical knowledge. It's not just something where Native people say we think something is true. It's based on some kind of experiment or replication. It's knowledge based on thousands of years of experience, of observation, of living within those systems. And so it's applied knowledge. That's what ecological knowledge is applied knowledge. And I want to show you an example of it. And I have a video.
Before European settlers arrived, Native American tribes in the Western U.S. were already forest management experts. Many Native peoples embraced fire as part of certain ecosystems. In fact, many trees in the West, like ponderosa pines and giant sequoias, are made healthier by regular human-managed fire. The Yakama Nation used prescribed burning to keep the forest healthy and to cultivate different resources they depended on, like berry plants. But when colonists showed up, it didn't occur to them that the forests were so impressive and the timber so strong because they'd been taken care of by humans.
I mean, they were very colorful responses. In some instances, they're just burning things up. They would also notice these abundant berry fields, and they wouldn't always make the connection.
In 1910, there was a massive wildfire that spread across Montana, Idaho, and Washington. As a result, the federal government was like, we've got to take better care of these forests. Time for a forest service. Up until that point, there had been some debate over prescribed burning. But the new agency imposed a hard and fast fire suppression policy. No burning, no exceptions. Traditional burning was outlawed, and tribal members were punished for practicing it. And it turns out that was not the best way to keep forests healthy. It was also really culturally oppressive.
Preventing fires was another way of directly reducing Native influence within their ancestral territories.
And forests that had been managed by humans for thousands of years were suddenly growing wild and unchecked. So that's basically how we end up here, in a period of time that's warmer than ever before in recorded history, with a whole lot of very unruly forests.
I was actually a consultant on that little video, and I was really pleased with the way it came out, because it shows, how important Indigenous knowledge is, and how we've gotten to the point where we're at, especially in the West, by suppressing Indigenous knowledge, and so Indigenous knowledge has to be part of environmental justice discourse when we're talking about what environmental justice means. So how do we decolonize environmental justice? My argument is that all this discourse of environmental justice must recognize this history of ongoing settler colonialism and the structures that it creates in this hegemonic paternalistic relationship with American Indian nations. And go beyond this concept of race. This is very problematic for us, being referred to as a race, because there are conservative forces right now that are trying to dismantle our sovereignty based on their argument that Native peoples are getting preferential treatment because we're a race, and of course that's constitutional. So there's actually a case headed to the Supreme Court that they hope will get there, where they can make that argument. And if it's called the Brackeen case, and if that happens, it will very potentially lead to the dismantling of the entire system of, recognition of whatever sovereignty we do have. Okay, so that's why we need to get away from this concept of race and emphasize nationhood. It needs to recognize, decolonizing environmental justice needs to recognize Indigenous peoples' different relationship to land based on these different epistemologies and ontologies. And the world, arguably, has a lot to learn from that. It also needs to recognize the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is about free, prior, and informed consent, which is what the Declaration enshrines, this right to consent of development that happens on Indigenous lands. But even though the U.S. has supposedly endorsed that agreement, they don't enforce it, and they only privilege consultation. But consultation is where, like Standing Rock went wrong. That's why we had consultation. That's why Standing Rock, the debacle of Standing Rock happened, was ultimately because there wasn't adequate consultation with the Standing Rock Sioux, and so we have to have recognition of Indigenous knowledge systems.